second day of the Fung Global Institute, the Carol session. Let me first introduce myself. I'm Tay Kok Peng. I'm the moderator for this session. And I hope that the speakers, I think we're on a tight time schedule, so there's a timekeeper over there who will give signals when we exceed a certain time period. I think in a highly influential book that came out a few years ago, just after the global financial crisis, called This Time is Different, by Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart. This book documented all the financial crises that has taken place in the world for the last 600 years. You would have thought that mankind would have learned something after the financial crisis, after all this time, Yet, we just had the mother of all financial crises since the Great Depression, and we are still in the midst of it. And which really run the risk of a serious relapse, depending on the outcome of what is going on in the Eurozone. I think in Asia, we did learn some lessons from the Asian financial crisis. And as you know, more than 10 years ago, then the biggest financial crisis ever since the Second World War took place. And in Asia, I think what happened, if you look back, the countries in this part of the world took the pain, either willingly or forced to by the IMF. And since then, I think the countries in this part of the world has put its house in order. They've reduced the budget deficit, they've run a current account surplus, they have made sure that both households and firms do not get over-leveraged. So I'm honored today to be moderating this session with a panel of highly distinguished former and present central bankers and regulators. And they will talk about how we can learn from the Asian and global financial crises. And they will give us their country, regional, and global perspective. In accordance with the brief of this session, they will help us rethink the Asian financial systems to help us avoid systemic risks, serve the real economy better, and to further sustainable and equitable growth. I will introduce the speakers in the order in which they will speak. First to speak will be Sir Howard Davis, who teaches at the Sciences Po University in Paris. Sir Howard, previously before this, was the director of the London School of Economics, and before that he was a deputy governor of Central Bank in the Bank of England, and then the Financial Services Authority in the UK from 1997 to 2003. Next to speak will be Mr. Liu Mingkang, who is now a distinguished fellow at the Fung Global Institute, and before that, he was the chairman of the China Regulatory Commission. I think most of you would have heard him speak yesterday. He was the keynote speaker, and he gave us a very inspirational speech, which ranged from the current financial problem, what he has done in China in reforming the banking crisis, and perhaps he will play an active role in the years to come in this whole issue of global climate change, which is probably, in some ways, in a long sweep of history, far more important than the financial crisis we are living through. After him, Mr. Reddy, the former governor of the Bank of England, will give his perspective, working from the global, then regional, and then to India-specific issues. Mr. Saito, the president of the Tokyo Exchange, will provide his views on what Asia is doing and can do more to increase financial intermediation among Asian countries, as well as to reduce the cost and improve the efficiency of such intermediation. Finally, Mr. Chi Pin, who just landed this morning. I think he was held back from coming earlier. I guess some visa issues and so on. So we are very glad that he is able to make it in time. And he's going to talk about the lessons that the CSRC has learned from the financial crisis and what CSRC is doing right now in China in terms of improving and reforming things. So without further ado, can I call upon Sir Howard to kick off? Thank you, Howard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peng, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be part of this conference, and particularly to be on this panel alongside MK, YB, and others whom I've known for some time. Now, Dr. Peng asked me to begin with what's going on in Europe, and partly because that, of course, is a preoccupation on the front page of every newspaper at the moment. But to do so, I hope in a way that tries to link across from what's going on in Europe into Asia, because that's really what we are talking about here today. I recall that a couple of years ago, I made a speech in Delhi, which was called Europe, the Lost Continent. And at the time, I was responding to a widespread view in Asia, but also to some extent in the US, that somehow Europe had dropped off the map economically and financially, and was no longer of great interest to the rest of the world. Well, the European Union has succeeded in making itself interesting again, and perhaps the cost of doing so may be quite high, but nonetheless, we're back on the front pages, and that's some kind of result for us Europeans. This has had all sorts of interesting consequences. There was a rather interesting report just on Monday of this week in London about imports into the English language from America, and detailing all the number of things that we now have to say, ridiculous phrases like going forwards, meaning in the future. This is the American myth that any move forward in time is by definition progress, which strikes me as being completely misunderstood, and how you have to use the word like as more or less every other word in every sentence. But the Eurozone crisis has also generated a vocabulary of its own. We now know about Brexit. Now that we know about bank jogs, a phrase we hadn't come across before, this is preparatory to a bank run, I think. And now that the focus has moved from Athens to Spain, we now know about Spandemonium. We've heard about Spanic, which may lead to Spain leaving, which is known as Squits. That's the only toilet reference that will be this morning. It's also produced quite a lot of wry stories. The only one perhaps repeatable here and short enough is that the man arrives at Athens airport and the immigration officer takes his passport without looking at it, looks at him and says nationality, he says German. The man says occupation, he says no, just visiting. But as we watch the evolution of this crisis, it is a little bit like watching a slow-moving train crash. And this is not, I think, the place for a detailed taxonomy or even perhaps an autopsy of the Eurozone. But what I thought I would do would be two things as quickly as I can. One, to give you a purely personal forecast of how I think this will play out in the coming months. I'll do that very quickly. And then some potential lessons for Asian finance, which will be a segue into the real topic for the day. First of all, the end game. Well, at the moment, all solutions to the Eurozone crisis can be put in one of two boxes. Box one is solutions which are politically possible, but economically and financially hopeless. Box two is solutions which are economically and financially sensible, but are politically impossible. Currently, box three, which are things which are politically possible and which would be economically and financially useful, is currently empty. We need to fill this box, and I think that it will eventually be filled, but things will probably have to get somewhat worse before we do so. I fear the outcome will be that Greece will in fact exit. I think the Greeks will not be able, no matter what happens in the election on the 7th of June, to deliver on the austerity package that they have in front of them, and that when they don't deliver and come back to the EU and to the Troika, there will be very little appetite for providing them with a new package. And then they will be obliged to default, And in principle, they could default and stay in the Eurozone. I think everything is possible. But I think for them to kickstart their economy, I fear that they will probably have to leave. I think that that will be the Lehman Brothers moment for the Eurozone. And just as in September 2008, the Fed then had to embrace the other investment banks, a loveless embrace, you might think, that the EU will need to protect the rest of the zone. Because I think what cannot happen is that Greece goes and the EU says, well, that's interesting, now let's see what happens next. Because I think that would create a contagion and a run which would be completely unmanageable. So what would happen then? Well, I think some combination of mutually guaranteed euro bonds, of the ECB buying debt from Spain and Italy on issue, a lender of last resort for banks, in other words, a bigger firewall created by a European Stability Mechanism, and a pan-European banking supervisor and mutually guaranteed deposit insurance. I think that sort of package will have to be produced. That will involve a significant deepening of the Eurozone. I expect that rather than a breakup, because I think the political investment in the Eurozone is simply too high. And politicians, unlike business people, do not have a notion of sunk costs. There are too many sunk political costs in the Eurozone for it to be abandoned. One side effect of this, which has some interest for me as an Englishman, though perhaps not for many other people in this room, is that those who are currently out of the Eurozone by choice will be even more distant from it in the future than they were in the past, and we will be moving explicitly to a two-speed European Union. I think there's a reasonable chance the UK will end up completely outside the European Union, but that will depend on some evolution of domestic politics. Now, some will contest this forecast, but I just put it on the table because I think it's useful to have an idea about what might happen and how things might evolve, and that's my current view. Now, the lessons and consequences, particularly focusing on Asia, well, the economic consequences are, of course, pretty serious, and I think will be quite material in the next few months. The EU took over as China's main trading partner from the US in 2007, and therefore a slowdown in the Eurozone, which strikes me as being inevitable, is going to have an impact. But here we're more talking about finance, and I think financial matters will be also noticeable, because EU banks provide, according to the Asian Development Bank, 9% of total domestic credit in this region, 3 times the share provided by US banks. And EU banks will be pulling back from this, indeed are doing so already, because they are needing to protect their capital position domestically. They're being forced to increase their capitalization, and that is involving them in pulling back from businesses, reducing lending, indeed selling off businesses where they can do so. And so I think that the Fung Institute is right to focus particularly on trade finance, because a lot of this is in the trade finance area, and looking at the way in which Asian banks can step into that emerging gap. And this may, of course, involve some regulatory changes in Asia as well to facilitate that process. Now, turning to the regulatory lessons, some, of course, of the lessons in Europe are very specific to the problems of a currency union. So let me just pick out 4 of the ones that I think are broader and not specifically just related to the EU. One, it seems to me that pre-crisis we had reached, in the West anyway, a kind of end of history in relation to monetary and financial management. That had 3 elements. One, that you typically gave different tasks to different institutions, monetary policy and regulation often being separated. You had an inflation target, and you did one big repo a month to fix the short-term rate. Capital requirements were set globally and fixed for all time. And that was it. Basically, we thought that was a kind of end of history in terms of how you managed complicated financial markets. I think we have now learned painfully that there are many complex interactions between monetary policy and financial policy can be divided into macro and micro, and the linkages are complicated between the two as well. And also that we need more regulation through the cycle. We had an element of pro-cyclicality in the regulatory environment pre-crisis. As a matter of fact, we may have some pro-cyclicality post-crisis as we are tightening capital requirements at a time when lending and credit are weak. But it's arguable that we really need a different kind of framework for thinking about how these things interact. And I believe that that general point is as relevant in Asia as it is in Europe. In Europe now we're moving towards different structures, the European Systemic Risk Board at the EU level, the Financial Policy Committee in London, which are attempting to integrate these things and provide intellectual frameworks for thinking about these interactions. And I think that they do have some lessons in this region as well. Second point is a linked one, in that I think we now better understand the relationships between the health of banks, the health of the sovereign, and the robustness of deposit protection schemes. Deposit protection schemes have tended to fall somewhat out of focus in the West, because in the UK, for example, we hadn't had a bank run for 150 years. When bank runs happen, people become quite interested in deposit protection schemes again, and bank runs can catch on. As Mervyn King perhaps unhelpfully pointed out, it's not rational to start a bank run, but it's rational to join one once it's underway. And therefore the arguments for more visible, pre-funded deposit protection schemes, I think, are much more powerful now than they were pre-crisis. Thirdly, I think we now see the need for a more diverse set of tools to manage the financial system. Now, arguably, this is a lesson that we should have learned from Asia. Indeed, we had moved towards a feeling that you were rather hands-off from the financial sector. You set a fixed set of capital requirements, and banks organised themselves within that framework. As John Gapper said actually just in yesterday's Financial Times, in future they, and he meant European regulators, need to act like Asian bank regulators, which are unafraid to be dirigistes in limiting deposit-funded lending institutions. And I've learned quite a lot from being on MK's International Advisory Board at the CBRC, who did maintain a more diverse set of controls, even within a framework where they were moving towards a freer banking market with more competition. But nonetheless, there were tools that you could use involving reserve requirements, different loan-to-deposit ratios, etc., which had fallen out of use, frankly, in developed countries. And I think that there will be a degree of convergence between the behavior of banking regulators in the West and in Asia in the future, with both sides learning from each other. And I think that that is an area where we can learn productively from each other. I think that Chairman Liu, when he initially set up his International Advisory Board, did very politely present this as an opportunity for us in the West to give advice to China. I think that the reality is that it's very much a two-way street at the moment. Fourthly and lastly, and here is an echo of what Michael Spence said yesterday about preparing for trouble and ensuring that you've got the right decision-making frameworks and that people have confidence in each other during good times in order to be able, for them to be able to act effectively in a crisis. It's very clear in the EU that the decision-making structures are not adequate to cope with a fast-moving financial crisis. I mean, that is so evident, it's painful. Interestingly, I recall a conversation I had when I was at the FSA with Jean-Claude Trichet at the Central Bank, and we talked about this. We talked about what would happen if there were a major financial crisis in Europe. At this point, I can't say we forecast the way one would turn out. This was about 2002. And Jean-Claude said to me, he said, well, I know, we all know who would need to be in the room to resolve this if it happened. And it would clearly involve the President of the ECB, it would clearly involve the Chairman of the FSA in London as the biggest financial centre in Europe, and we listed the people. And I said to him, well, that's absolutely true, but the fact is this group never meets, actually. And it did not. There was not, in fact, an effective crisis management group in operation. And indeed, I would argue there still is not, although the European Systemic Risk Board, now chaired by Mario Draghi, is probably the nearest thing we get to it. And I think that to think about that in an Asian context and to say, if we did face a major market disruption again, like we had in the late 90s in Asia, what would the decision-making framework need to be? Who would need to be in that room to act decisively and quickly to deal with it? And ask, do we have that structure in place? And my hypothesis is the answer to that is currently no. And that's a gap that could usefully be filled. That's my 4 lessons, so I'll now hand you back to Asia after this brief and unhappy diversion into Europe. Thanks.
Thank you, Howard. Very interesting presentation. Can I call upon Mr. Liu Mingkang now?
Thank you. I will be very brief because everybody knows recent changes and colorful news brought by Howard to us once again highlighted that the weaknesses of the global financial system. And so we got to recheck our thoughts and to see what happened in this area and where we can improve and better our systems to guard against our future war, past war. I think 5 points in my mind deeply I want to share with you. The first one is that Asian should work hand in hand and very hard to develop strong capital markets. And there are 3 facet story here. Talking about the strong capital markets in Asia, if you look at including the Chinese ones and many others, we definitely will be meeting 3 stories. The first is size vis-a-vis depth. The size is very conspicuous and attracted almost all eyes of those people from every corner of the world. But it doesn't make any sense to talk about size itself. By the end of the day, the depth of the capital market that works. So this is the first. And the second point is the relationship between the stock market and the bond market. And we have for quite a long time, Asia enjoys a comparatively good market of stocks, and we got lessons and experience both from that. But talking about the bond issuance and bond market, I don't think it's quite ripe until now. And the third one is how we can balance the performance vis-a-vis the culture. And what we need in this, to play the games, you got to know the rules and got to abide by the rules. So I think the value culture vis-a-vis the performance. Sometimes you can hear a lot of ballyhoo about the performance in Asia, but then if you look at in the details carefully, then automatically it will popping up a lot of questions around value and culture and integrity as well. Second, when we talk about strong capital markets, we need strong stakeholders, such as a lot of quality intermediaries, like rating agencies, auditors, solicitors, the whole legal framework to support that. And we need a lot of quality fund managers, have a long commitment to the customers and the markets both. And they can offer the source of the economic return, value, reputation, and also, far more important, is the risk management. So plus them together, and including the regulators and the supervisors and all these long-term and short-term investors, these stakeholders got to be stronger to support a stronger capital market here. And the thirdly is that nowadays something happened in a quiet way. a lot of people didn't notice that in Asia, but actually it happened in Asia. Let me set up a Korean example. Korean, in the past 4 years, in the midst of the difficulties and challenges, the government took the lead to sign more FTAs than any other country in this region. And they set up the benchmark for themselves in housing. This is off record, and the first point is that the more the better. The second is the sooner the better. When you sign FTA with someone else, you got quickly activize that. So that's the role played by the government to make sure that the FTA will become a main driver of the regional trade and growth and investment. It brings and is bringing huge benefits to LG, Hyundai, and many others. So, in my mind, I think intra-Asia trade and investment should be maintained and protected, and they shouldn't be unfairly tarnished by external effects. So, intra-Asian FTA with new standards and the benchmark like green economic growth it got to be a main driver of regional trade and growth, and the driver of the integration of finance and the capital markets. And the good news came that China, Korea, and Japan, the three countries sit down together in talking about the FTA sign and arrangement on us. And good news also came from Singapore, and it's a lot of people surrounded the Singapore and talking about a very excellent quality level and a platform to pay, to linking with each other to promote the trade and investment. Fourthly, I think we got try our best to improve the regulatory coherence. We don't need identical treatment from country to country, because every country has its unique characteristics. But facing a lot of pending issues coming from BCBS and FSA, still today, a lot of controversies around liquidity coverage ratio, and for example, it's caused a lot of backlash. And so for such a complicated situation, I think Asian countries should hand in hand to work together and have rigorous insight into the new framework of regulation and supervision. And such a regulatory coherence in Asia will set up an example for the whole world, and to show that in the future, the toughest question, the cross-border arrangement, when we meet fading institutions in financial sector, could be concretely solved and quickly solved as well. So this is very important. Last but not least, number 5, deeply in my mind, is we do need a much stronger protection of property rights, intellectual property rights in particular. What happened in the future, or what happening now, a lot of people didn't notice that, is that we are facing the 3rd industrial revolution. It will brought huge changes, sea changes of people's mindset, the behaviors, and the way of doing the businesses. People do not need to go to office and to go to somewhere else to attend a conference like this. It's a real story to see the 3D design, 3D printing and the 3D delivery of persons to attend the conference hall. Okay, when that happened with this appropriate cost level, that we brought this another sea changes, heavy pressures upon industrialization, urbanization, and into our daily life. Are we ready to do this? We got to, first thing first, is to strengthen the protection upon the property rights, especially intellectual property rights, to make sure that in Asia we create a very solid environment to support such a change. And you can never forget that, because by the end of the day, Asian people should realize that whatever the world throws at you, just a copy. And that is the way to do today's business in Asia. I just want to stop here and leave the room for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Reddy? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to Andrew and Victor for inviting me to this event. It has been very enlightening. It's a historic event, I believe. With regard to the new Asian financial architecture, I'll present what I consider to be the issues for the research agenda at 3 levels: global, regional, and national. At a global level, Asia has to contribute to the changing global financial architecture. It is bound to change, and Asia has to play a more active role in the future. At the same time, Asia has to adjust to the global financial architecture as it evolves. It's not that we dictate. So in that, I agree with Paul's position yesterday, Mr. Paul Volcker's position, that the most important is the international monetary system, or international monetary non-system. So you have one reserve currency dominating the world, which is not subject to any global rules, which is not subject to market discipline, and therefore it is a non-system. The debate is, what do you do with it? One approach is, you can say, don't have it. Then are you going to have another single currency? If there is another single currency, then problems should normally be similar. Or is it going to be multiple currencies? And if it's multiple currencies, then you have the problem of externalities, and inevitably it will go towards one. Basically, the nature of global trade being what it is, at least that should be considered. What's the scope for multiple currencies to coexist, multiple reserve currencies? And the third issue is that would you have an SDR, and SDR is a unit of account. And in the final settlement, you require a currency. Unless SDR becomes a global currency and IMF becomes a market maker. And then you have the whole issue of global governance. Okay, we want to have a global currency, good, have a global currency, which means you require a global monetary authority. My problem is that if the global authority exists and it fumbles, the whole humanity suffers. So maybe it is better to have a messy non-system than a strong global monetary system with the risk of collapse for the whole world. But my point is that we have to look at this. That's important. Current state of affairs, no good. Better state, look for it. We don't know. 2, more realistically, and I find in the agenda, the scope for Asian currencies to become internationalized. Is internationalization same as reserve currencies? What are the advantages of reserve currency? What are the disadvantages of reserve currency? For the country, for the region, for the world. We cannot view it as in an emotional sense. And it's a new type of global situation that we are doing, not what it was 20, 30 years ago for a variety of reasons. So I think we have to be, at least now coming to India, my own hunch, subject to whatever the results is, that I would not recommend to India that you should try to get global reserve currency at all. At least not for quite some time to come, for a variety of reasons. But I think the research will have to address this issue squarely. So that I would say is one aspect of the globe. second is the financial, but the other way, which I think has started already, is what we may call, you have different shades of non-system. And in the non-system, you have mechanisms like increasing the role of local currencies, like what renminbi agreements. So you immunize the trade and other aspects from the vicissitudes of the global non-system. So you have multiple channels of protecting yourselves. So maybe that's something which we should pursue. Second, with regard to the global financial architecture and the global financial institutions which you have, IMF and World Bank, I think it is very clear that there will be a shift in the balance, and which means not only that Asia will have a greater say, Asia will have a greater responsibility in that sense for the global financial system. And this has to be carefully negotiated. And then we have G20, about which there are a lot of hopes, but if you see the record, I think it's a classic case of diminishing returns from the beginning. So meeting after meeting, there's less and less achievement, and more hope, perhaps, I don't know. Now we come to the Financial Stability Board. I think Financial Stability Board is still drafting a lot more as a reaction to what has happened than a longer term perspective. And what is Basel III? How does Basel III contribute to growth? And for many of us, growth is as important as stability or social cohesion. So maybe we'll have to go beyond Basel III for the longer term if we are looking at the structural factors and the factors like interaction between real and finance. And now as far as India's role here is concerned, I think India's given its own problems, and significant problems of poverty within the country, and the need for significant growth. It tends to be a little more domestic demand-driven, domestic supply-driven. So it will perhaps definitely be to be influential, but I won't say that it will be quote-unquote powerful in that sense. But it will have to play a very responsible role both in Asia and globally. But I think the good thing that has happened is the type of multiple initiatives that have been taken in the global arena with Chiang Mai initiative. I think that will also create certain stabilizing factors if we accept that fundamental changes may not be easy to bring about because of the essential issues. And here we go to the regional level. I think when it comes to the regional level, the most important lessons we have to learn is from Eurozone. The most important lesson, and Howard has explained very well, is the linkage between monetary, finance, and fiscal. There should be a virtual convergence of these three authorities, or these three policies. And you have to look at the sovereign situation with the balance. So we cannot, the contribution of financial sector will depend on the macroeconomic environment. And the macroeconomic environment very much depends on the national public policies. So therefore, I would say that one has to be very careful with regard to currency integration and financial integration is the lesson from Eurozone. Whereas there are huge benefits through integration of trade and integration and foreign investments, FDI in particular. I think that's one lesson I would take. So what does it mean for Asia with regard to regional arrangements? One, concentrate on trade finance. Two, concentrate on foreign direct investment. Three, you have regional surveillance, regional exchange information, regional cooperation among monetary authorities, which is slightly different. That means you reinforce the regional framework within which the national policies are conducted. And here, Indian position, in my view, analytically, the Indian position is that its capacity to integrate into the regional level and the global level is constrained by two factors. The fiscal position is so difficult to manage, it makes itself highly vulnerable. And second, there's a financial repression to take care of the fiscal dominance. So till such time we resolve the fiscal dominance and the financial repression, we will not be able to proceed with integration of the rest of the world, assuring stability. So I think these are the fundamental issues which, and in terms of vulnerability to shocks, India is pretty vulnerable to several shocks, both on current account and capital account. On current account, and we have the food, possible shock to the food, to the fuel, as I mentioned, fiscal, financial, and external flows. The volatile flows are quite large. So in a way, therefore, Indian growth story will be very much dominated, while there will be, given the large size, there will be increasing integration and increasing presence, both at the corporate level and at the financial sector level. The growth will be significantly driven by the way the vulnerabilities are handled. But in terms of fundamentals, I think it has strong fundamentals. The household savings are almost on par with China. The savings investment levels are high. The innovation, the basic innovation is strong, and productivity increases are by and large quite impressive. So in a way, I would say that Indian contribution in the global economy will be gradual and will depend very much on the way its fisc is maintained. Now, how does the Asian financial architecture contribute to the national level policies? I think there we have to learn from. We have learned a lot from the Asian crisis, most of us, but now we have to learn from the global financial crisis. What are the lessons? One, avoid excessive financialization. And what is excessive financialization? In fact, more recently there have been studies by BIS also. And also avoid excessive leverage. And leverage on all the four balance sheets, one has to look at it, not one. That is the government balance sheet, the household balance sheet, the corporate balance sheet, the financial sector balance sheet. So the excessive credit, excessive leverage, and excessive financialization. So what is excessive? That's where the problem is. We know that we are far away from excessive, but we have to make sure that we don't cross the output. And the work of the global financial architecture reform institute should really be able to contribute for a greater understanding of what I might call optimal financialization and minimizing the complexity of the financial innovations. And Canada provides a fairly good example of usually perhaps the most balanced approach to financial sector regulation. And in terms of overall objectives, I think one thing which we have to learn from both the US, UK experience and perhaps European experience is we have to aim at inclusive finance. I make a distinction between inclusive finance and financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is that you are trying to bring in people who are outside finance. No, the finance itself should be designed that it is inclusive, and which means the financial services should be accessible to all, affordable to all, and variety of obligations can be put, which include financing to SMEs. And finally, in some ways, one could look at, given the significant common factors, some sort of a standards of disclosure, standard codes of finance. And Andrew himself had presided over standards and codes, for the Asian crisis at some stage, and I think we can lead this exercise and give. It may include sort of code of ethics for various participants, not just the regulators, whether it's the credit rating agencies, whether it's stock exchanges, some sort of code of ethics, standards of governance, and I think that's where the Fung Institute will be able to provide a significant contribution. And I will stop here. The only thing I want to say here is you must have read the recent book by Schiller on finance and good society. So I just thought that the ideal book should be Good Finance and Society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Reddy. With still two speakers to go, I think with all the suggestions that has been made, Andrew, I think you have your work more than cut out for you in terms of the suggestions. Next, we'll come to Mr. Saito, please.
Well, looking back the real reason why the advanced state facing this financial crisis, I think all this advanced state has suffered the shortage of demand because we or they had made a crucial effort to increase the productivity or introduction of the new production system. Very ironically, that made up the excessive products all over the world. So governments are forced to make the artificial demand. That is the reason why even the Wall Street or wherever it is try to make the intentionally the leveraged finance or securitization, whatever it is. Then finally, the state itself, that must have been the last resort, having the non-performing loan. It can be very dangerous risk matters. We have a lot of lesson in the case of the United States as well as Europe, I think. So how Asia should respond or set up the future business is that the still I think that we should respect the market mechanism. These advanced state seems to be have respected the market mechanism, but the reality is that they ignores the market functions. Regardless the response or reaction from the market, they continuously issue the aiding papers and distribute it. That was the reason why we are now in the traps. In Asia, SME is a key, I think. Even in the United States or any country, SME is the key. In the United States, recently, by the name of JOBS, J-O-B-S, new rule enacted in order to finance for the SME. So in Asia, the most SME are financed by the banks. To some extent, that is okay, but I think in order to smooth out the flow of funds to these profitable SMEs, we had better think of the two ways. One is naturally the fixed income issuance, and another one is equity. As for the fixed income, as you may know already, a long time the Asian Development Bank has done projections. They said the ABMI, the Asian Bond Market Initiatives, has been long underway. So we are better take advantage of their facilities to promote the primary issuance as well as the secondary market trading, if possible. And as for the equity, the Asian market already enjoying the quite reasonable or sizable equity market, and particularly in the Southeastern Asian state the areas, the Singapore and Malaysia already made up a sign to make their joint market or so. I think we have already in the equity market the Regional Exchange Federation by the name of AOSEF. It is including Asian, all countries and Oceanian Stock Exchange Federation. So we had better take advantage of this federation to set up the some common rule, harmonized rule in these regions, with a very much different way from the Western society. That means, I think, with a much more high nobility of the virtue or moral sense in the finance is more important. I think Asian people can share the value or meanings of the business or financial functions which is not only for the sake of the money maker or greedy money chasers. Rather, our mission is to provide the healthy fund to the SME or where it is entrepreneurs with the very high morale, and that is very important. So I would like to propose that in these Asian regions, there should not be a well standardized consultations of market, rather than a way that seeks to build soft alliances through mutual competition and sophistication based on common sense of values. That is a very possible. Acknowledging unique histories and culture and the differences in the economic structure and each state national regulation. So I think these soft alliance will be suited to Asian market. So again, I'd like to say we should share common ideas, establish rules unique to these regions, and build market in the conservative and efficient way. If we can be of assist anything, already we made up our professional fixed income market in Japan, or European, some banks are financing there. Also, we relax totally the regulations, language, accounting standard, corporate governance standard for the sake of the SME group for Asian corporations. So we like to collaborate with the all friend exchange in these areas. That's what I agree.
Thank you, Sato. Mr. Chi-Ting.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Fund Institute for inviting me to come to this conference to provide me the opportunity to learn from experts from all over the world and the fellow panelists to better understand the financial crisis and how we should move forward. And also, it is a great learning experience for me, particularly the past session, because we, CSRC, is just about to launch our own think tank, the Beijing Institute of Securities and Futures. So we would like to learn from the Fund Global Institute on how to build and run a global leading think tank. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you some of our thoughts on how we should learn from the crisis and what's going on in the Chinese capital markets. First, on the crisis. I think we can learn a great deal from the past two crises, one in the US, one in the Europe. And I think a lot of consensus has already been reached in the global community, such as financial industry should serve the real economy instead of just playing money game of itself. And also, for example, we should pay more attention to systemic risks and other risks as well. I mean, the JP Morgan incident just showed that how hard it is to gauge, to assess risks and to contain and stay disciplined. I think we also learn from the crisis that we need to enhance regulatory coordination or collaboration as the markets are getting more and more integrated, and the regulation is still stays within borders. However, I think we have to be very careful when we try to draw lessons from the crisis, which happen in advanced markets. And it's also dangerous just to adopt those lessons and apply them to emerging markets. I'm not expert on other Asian markets. I can just take China as one example. Chinese markets very much different from the advanced markets in two aspects. First, it has very short history, less than 22 years, whereas in most of the advanced markets have more than 200 years of history. And secondly, Chinese market is very much typical top-down approach versus like a bottom-up approach like the US, because we start from a planning economy. So we really have to be very, very careful. For example, we know that too much sophistication in financial products, or too many of them, were part of the reason for the crisis in the States. Whereas in China, we have too many. We don't have so many sophisticated products. We have just launched one financial derivative, the index future, 2-3 years ago. So there's a long way to go. Another point is that we know that part of the reasons why U.S. had a crisis in 2008 was the over-leverage of financial institutions. Lehman Brothers had a leverage ratio of more than 140 prior to the crisis, prior to its bankruptcy. In China, the securities firms has a leverage ratio of 1.3. So it's merely just, there's basically no leverage at all. So that's another difference. Also, we have to know that in a lot of the markets, like in the States, over-liberalization is probably the problem. But in China, liberalization is still the way to go. So I think knowing all those differences, we cannot just simply come to a simple conclusion and being very simplistic. I think one thing I personally think we can draw lesson from the Eurozone crisis is that I think with globalization, the world has become flat. And I think every economy or nation, they have to re-examine its own competitiveness, meaning that you have to look carefully how you can win in this very much competitive and integrated world. For some of the European economies, I think in terms of labor cost, they are not so competitive with, China or India or Brazil. In most of the sectors, Chinese labor cost is still like 1/10 of the Europeans. So on that front, I think Europe doesn't have competitive edge. On the other front, the innovation, I think I don't think it can compete with the States. Therefore, I think that can partially explain the reason why 3 years after the 2008 crisis, I think the world is surprised to see that Europe is actually in bigger trouble than US. And I think behind that, the reason behind that, our understanding is that the financial structure has some influence on the economic resilience and the recovery, the speed of recovery. I think the States has a very much market-driven or market-oriented financial system, and Europe is very good at commercial banks. China is similar to Europe. In terms of financing, our financing structure is very much like bank versus capital market, 80-20. Similar in Europe, and the US is just about the reverse. It's like 20-80.
Mr. Jinping, can we try to finish off early to give time for
Just
sorry.
2 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Therefore, I think it's our objective and our agenda to promote a capital market in China, and I'm very happy that Chairman Liu actually shared my view on that. Thanks to his leadership, Chinese banks are very healthy and robust, probably just too robust, and well, that's a compliment. I think what's going on in China right now, on top of our agendas, a couple of things. Number one, we try to build on equity side, we try to build we call it multi-layer capital market system. Meaning that we have only the main board. Just as an example, the US market is very much a pyramid structure. NYSE has 2,300 companies, NASDAQ 2,700, OTCBB plus Pink Sheet, which is the OTC market, has about 9,000 companies. and the gray market below that was 60,000. In China, the main board has more companies than the small and medium board, which has more company than the enterprise, the growth enterprises board, and which is bigger than the OTC market, which has only 115 listings. So we need to expand the OTC market. We're promoting the third and fourth board. And in China, I'll give you some idea of what's going on in China. In Beijing, the number of companies qualified for IPO in Beijing alone is more than 1,000. CSRC typically can approve about 300 companies per year. And therefore, if we want to finish the task for Beijing, we need 3.5 years. And we have 31 provinces. So this just cannot meet the economic need. Secondly, we need to promote the bond market. In most markets, the size of the bond market is probably like twice as much as the equity market. But in China, it's less than half. And so we're about to launch the China's version of high yield bond. And we also try to improve the investor interest protection mechanism by encouraging companies to pay more dividend and improving the delisting mechanism. And we're also paying more attention to the corporate governance of listed companies to improve their quality. And more importantly, I think the development of institutional investors in China is in urgent need, particularly the long-term institutional investors. We're promoting the 401k, kind of China's version of 401k plan in China, because China's market is probably among the most speculative ones in the world. Back in 2007, the turnover ratio of Chinese market is about 900, and the world average is about 150. I think just one sentence. I think the macroeconomics background for all this reform is that China has entered a stage where after 30 years of growth, you have a lot of wealth accumulation in the society, and you have also a lot of financing need for the enterprises and companies. But you find that we have this dilemma, they cannot meet each other. And in a city like Wenzhou, that everybody knows that this is one of the most wealthy cities in China. But in this city, a lot of companies got bankrupt because they run out of money and they cannot get financed. This is the dilemma for Wenzhou and also for China. I think the best way is just try to build the capital market and further liberalize the financial sector so that Chinese economy can enter a stage of more sustainable growth for the next decade. China is, the year end of 2010, the per capita GDP of China was $4,300, which is about the famous mid-income trap. And if China can keep up with the 12th five-year plan, which is 7% per year growth, then by 2020, China will most likely achieve per capita GDP of $10,000, which is successfully walk out of the middle-income trap. So I think all this reform is geared towards supporting Chinese economy for better and sustainable growth. I think I have to stop.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to squeeze you out. The last speaker is always,
That's okay.
But can I, before the Q&A, because we have up to 11:30, and there's insufficient time, so can I exercise my prerogative as a moderator to zero the discussion and the Q&A to do what I see to be key issues if I take the strengths of what the speaker is saying? Taking the lead from the brief of the session, how does the financial sector serve the real economy? So what are the needs of the real economy at present? It seems to me, listening to the speakers, is that right now in the world, because of the financial crisis, voluntary regulation, and the uncertain environment we are in, there's a shortage of risk capital, whether for the SME, there's a shortage of long-term capital for this part of the world that requires still a lot of infrastructure, long-term investments. So I would hope that other questions or panelists can address that. The second issue, which is not discussed, but which is at the back of quite a lot of discussion, is the issue of should the financial system continue to evolve to more complexity. I think all of you have read more recently about what happened with JP Morgan, where even senior management didn't know what was going on, and even after they learned what was going on, didn't understand what happened because it was so complex. Okay, have we reached a stage now where the complexity is such that we are getting into the unknown, to use a Ramsell phrase, that we only know what happened after the event, or what happened after the event, but don't know why it happened or what happened. It's just something happened. So I would hope that we can have a discussion on those two issues. Thank you. Yeah, I think the gentleman that put up his hands first. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for sharing that very interesting and insights with us. When I look at the title of our discussion this morning, Asia Financial Architecture, the question that first came to my mind is that how do you design an Asian financial architecture which is decoupled, from the rest of the world? So as capital flows, sort of cuts across boundaries and countries, either with a closed system or an open system. So my question is that, is there really an effective mechanism to monitor and regulate some of the speculative capital flows across the various countries? I mean, that caused really the former Asian financial crisis and the impact fallout of the last global financial crisis. My second question is a very, very brief one. The interest rate inflation targeting has been in use in the West, the central banks and the ECB and also the UK. I'd like to ask how useful has that has been used as a tool in the West, and also how useful it is for Asian, for the Asian region in inflation targeting as a monetary tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is it all right if we just take the first question? The second question really runs into monetary policy, and that is an issue that will take us, another whole day to discuss. So, on the first question, Howard, would you like to have a crack at that?
I understand the uncertainty behind your question, and indeed, of course, you can say that everything is connected to everything else, and that what you really need is some sort of all-seeing global financial observatory positioned, no doubt, in some kind of satellite above the Earth, looking at everything and how it makes everything else. But the reality is that there are global issues, and there are regional issues, and there are national issues, I think, and that there are dimensions of the Asian financial system which are interlinked, and those should be a subset which is capable of being analysed and monitored and overseen by Asian financial institutions. I think you've got to be very careful to identify what it is you're looking at, but I think things like the financing of intra-regional trade, for example, at the moment, I think is a manageable issue you can get your arms around, and it is an Asian question. So I agree there have got to be linkages between your regional observatories and your global observatories and your national observatories, but I do think there is a regional dimension that is worth looking at.
Thank you. Yeah, Henry Sender.
So much. Dr. Tay, I'd like to ask a question related to your first question, which is about the short-term, the shortage of long-term capital in the region, and how the region gains control of its own fortunes. Maybe if we widen it out a bit from the banks, the shortage isn't as dire as we think. So I would like to ask you a question, and that is the extent there are...
I'm the moderator.
There are great deep pools of capital in this region, long-term capital, which is to say the sovereign wealth funds and the pension funds like NPS of Korea. Do you see a role for these pockets of funds both in providing long-term finance, such as infrastructure, and coming up with innovative ways to channel money to SMEs? Thank you, and forgive me.
Yeah, I think there's a role for pension funds and sovereign wealth funds to invest more into infrastructure in this part of the world. But the big pools of money are not as big or as deep as you suggest. You know, they do asset allocation and they do have fiduciary responsibilities and so on. So a certain percentage can be allocated. But in relation to the infrastructure needs of this part of the world, I think the amounts exceed far more than what this institution money can provide. So you do need private, these other sources of funds. Please.
Thank you. Dr. Tay, maybe focusing on your first question, this could really be directed to a number of people on the panel, is as we are adding more regulation to ensure that what's happened in the past doesn't happen again, there are times where I wonder if the cure could be worse than the disease. That is where there's so much regulation that it actually inhibits the free flow of capital. And many of you have had regulatory positions. I'd be interested in your views as to how do you balance ensuring that a crisis doesn't occur again, or at least it's moderated, focused balance against trying to help the very people you're seeking to protect. How do you strike that balance? Because I am fearful that there are times where I fear it's going too far to one side. And we have a tendency, I think, around the world to do that, to swing back and forth. So I'm interested as how you strike that balance. It really can be directed to really a number of people, Dr. Tay, on the panel.
Thank you. Yeah. Mr. Lee, you want to try to have address that?
It's a good question. We have limited time to talk about this long story, but just to give you some basic idea. Basically, the first thing first, for regulators and supervisors, I think they must remember it's a fine line between much too much and not enough. Okay? So if you don't know that delicate fine line, you got to recheck your thoughts, what you want order. So in our book, prevention is the best cure. So everything you do is that you just ask the people stand side by side with you on the same line to look forward and what will be happening in the future. The forward-looking attitude is very important, and then you put some brakes upon that, saying that this is the prevention measures we got to take. So this is the best cure. You know, a lot of events vividly show the picture after death, the doctors. And even the doctors at that event are still controversial about the reason why he's there. So it's no good. Another thing is that if you don't make sure that people are smart enough, armed with adequate resources, skills, knowledge, and experiences to do something cross-sector and cross-board, please mention this. A long firewall is the best cure on their books.
Thank you, Governor Liu. I think we have about 5 minutes left, so can you make your question short and the answer also equally short?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jassim Ahmed. I'm from the Islamic Financial Services Board. My question is not about Islamic finance. It's really to challenge, to pick up on what Victor Fung said this morning, is to challenge our preconceptions. I want to ask, is this really a global crisis or is this a transatlantic crisis? And I want to pose that question because I feel that that particular slide over there, the red slide, that Asian financial institutions are vulnerable, that is true. But my understanding of the data is, and the financial flow that we see in Asia and its links to the rest of the world, is that vulnerability is much less today than it was in 1997. And therefore, and when people cite the ADB study, I used to work at ADB, I love the ADB, but the number that is being cited by the ADB as representing Asian vulnerability to a collapse in Europe is, in my view, misleading. If we look rather at the numbers coming from the Bank of International Settlements, that shows that the contribution made by external financing, the bank credit, domestic bank credit growth in Asia is declining, it's very small. But my question remains, is this a global crisis or is this a transatlantic crisis?
Who wants to take this one? This is an empirical issue on statistics. I'm not sure the governors are at that level, on the statistical side and so on. I don't know. Anybody want to have a crack at that? Maybe I can have a crack at that, and then my sense is that the shock, the vulnerability is more through the real economy effect than the financial side. And the financial side, I think there are enough banks in Asia who are able to take up the financing that is left over by European banks. In fact, I would say in Asia, even the American banks are picking up the slacks left behind by the European bank. So I suspect there will be an adjustment period, but it may not be as severe as people think. I'm speaking as a board member of a bank in Singapore, and I get some feedback from the management of the bank. But I think the vulnerability to the real shock of the slowdown and even another recession or depression in Europe will have knock-on effects all around, including Asia. Right? So, yeah. Okay. Yeah. One more question. I see a hand in the back. Sorry.
Thanks. Simon Cox from The Economist magazine. It's my understanding that when Japan succeeded in liberalising its bond market 20, 25 years ago, that contributed to the fragility of Japanese banks because they lost their best borrowers to the capital markets. Do our Chinese panellists worry that something similar might happen in China if you were to succeed with the bond market promotion you've talked about? Thanks very much.
We worried partially, not the full like that, because the philosophy has is a deep root in the mindset of the Chinese people and the businessmen, because they are always following an English saying goes, East and West, who wants best? Okay. Whatever markets you create abroad, if I don't know, I won't believe that. And partially, some Chinese companies, they are go abroad and they are talking about working closer to their clients either in other countries and so on and so forth. But I think they are carefully monitored by the banks and lenders, because the banks by and large in China still is the biggest largest checks and balances, and they have been cultivated for quite a long time that grass is not greener. That's just as a rule.
Okay, one more question.
Well,
sorry.
Well, I think if it happens, it's good for China. I think in the long run, I firmly believe that the market will allocate resources much more efficient than commercial banks. But we have to make this process a gradual process. You cannot do it overnight. Then you probably have a big problem. Thanks.
Okay. One more question, we still have a bit of time.
Thanks, David Murray from Sydney. I'm just wondering, what we haven't discussed in the overall architecture is the relationship between government and its agencies. It seems to me in a great society, government is prepared to be accountable, and government can't just run its agencies, its prudential agencies, its central banks on a set and forget basis. Probably a difficult question, but if a central bank has full employment as part of its charter, doesn't that politicise the central bank too much and induce it to have too easy a monetary policy, which combined with a loose fiscal policy is a kickstarter to bubbles?
As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, last time, this is more a monetary policy question. But in terms of institutional dynamics, one of the lessons of the global financial crisis is that if you talk about monetary policy, we concentrate on one objective, one instrument as the most efficient, that has collapsed. Therefore, basically, the interconnectedness has come out into the open. which means that the central bank independence has to be essentially compromised for all various agencies. The coordination in public policy has become more important. Conflict of interest in private sector has become more important. These two were neglected, which led to the crisis.
Thank you. I think I have the latest example of that in the turnaround by the ECB, I think, late last year. Yeah, well, can I now close the session? I think it's been a very good, far-ranging session. Some of the issues go far beyond that. So can I just ask you to, thank our distinguished panel? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh yeah.